Okay, so today's daf is Yurchet. We're going to start with the new Mishnah on Yud Zayin Amud Bet. These are all famous Mishnayot for those who have the custom of reading the Mishnayot of Shabbat during Shabbat at the meals of Shabbat, which is a good custom to do because then you're very fluent with them. Beit Shammai Omrim, Beit Shammai says, "En shorin dios v'samanim v'karshinin ele kedei sheishoru mi be'od yom." What does this mean? It means you cannot soak dye. What they used to do is they would take whatever substance was the coloring substance and they would soak it in water to make dye. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to soak samanim, other kinds of paints and colorings, and also karshinin are food for the animals. You're not allowed to soak these substances in water erev Shabbat unless they're going to become totally softened and totally broken down mi be'od yom, before Shabbat starts. Beit Hillel matrin, Beit Hillel allows this. We're going to see in the Gemara that the reason why Beit Shammai does not permit this to be done is because Beit Shammai maintains that there's a prohibition called shevitat kelim. Shevitat kelim means that not only is a person not allowed to do malacha on Shabbat, and not only is a person's animal not allowed to do malacha on Shabbat, but even a person's vessels are not allowed to do malacha on Shabbat, and that means that a person's pot cannot be in the process of breaking down these dyes, because what they would do was they would put the dye, they would put the substance in water, and they would also cook it in there to soften it. They can't do that over Shabbat because your pot is working. That's what the Beit Shammai says. Beit Hillel says no, there's no such concept. The Beit Shammai omrim en notnin unin shel pishtan letoch hatanur ela kedei sheyafilu me'od yom, that you can't put these stalks of flax in the oven unless they're going to become bleached while it's still day. That's what they used to do. They used to put it in the oven. Velo et tzemer leyora elek sheyiklot ha'ayin, and you can't put the cloth or the fabric, the wool into a pot of dye unless it's going to absorb the dye while it's still daytime. So earlier we were talking about making the dye by soaking it in water. Here we're talking about taking the fabric and soaking it in the dye. Beit Hillel matirin, and in all these cases Beit Hillel also is lenient. Why? Because in all these cases you set the process going before Shabbat. The process is going into Shabbat. Beit Shammai doesn't like that because of shevitat kelim, as we're going to see. Beit Shammai omrim en porsin mitzudot chayav ve'ofot v'dagim elech kedei sheyitzodu mi be'od yom. Beit Hillel matirin. Similarly, Beit Shammai says you cannot set up traps for animals erev Shabbat unless they're going to be filled with animals before Shabbat starts. In other words, you can do it on Friday, but you can't leave it to catch animals over Shabbat, because then your trap is working on Shabbat. And that's a prohibition of shevitat kelim according to Beit Shammai.
Unless you already trapped animals before Shabbat?
You can do it on Friday, but only if but you can't leave them out on Friday afternoon to work on Shabbat. Basically. So, Beit Shammai omrim en mochrin lenochri ve'en to'aninim ve'en magbin alav ela kedei sheyagi lamakom karov. Beit Shammai says you cannot sell anything to a non-Jew on Friday. You can't load his donkey or load his car, I guess we would have today. You can't put any package on his back unless he's going to get to whatever his destination is before Shabbat. Why? That's an application of this. We're going to see. That's an application of this. On Shabbat, no, but before Shabbat, there's some question about that because of this. It's actually a machloket. There's an argument among contemporary poskim because of based on these ideas here. But Beit Shammai would say unless it's going to reach its destination before Shabbat, you can't do it. But Beit Hillel matirin, Beit Hillel is lenient, and we're going to see they're lenient, but it's not so clear how lenient they are from the Mishnah. So Beit Shammai omrim en notnin orod abdan velo kilim lakoves nochri ela kedei sheyasu mi be'od yom. You can't give your clothing to the cleaners or your animal skins to somebody who works with tanning hides before Shabbat unless there's enough time for him to complete your job before Shabbat. In other words, you can't go over to the cleaners 5 minutes before Shabbat, drop off your clothing, and they're going to do it over Shabbat, even though he's non-Jewish.
That sounds like an application that we just learned in the halacha of the day.
Yeah, because this is Beit Shammai.
This is Beit
So of Chulan Beit Hillel matirin im hashemesh, and in all of these Beit Hillel is matir im hashemesh, which means he allows you to do it up to sunset. He says as long as it's out of your hands before the sun goes down, it's not your problem.
Even if it continues.
Right? Even if it continues on, even if the non-Jew goes and he does the work for you on Shabbat, it's no problem. Now that's a different story because that's in the house of the non-Jew. When it's in your own house, it's more complicated. That's what we're talking about today. When you give something over to somebody else and they're doing it in their house and you don't know what they're doing, as long as you give it to them before Shabbat, it's a different story. Well, we'll see. So now we come to Yurchet Amud Aleph. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Noagin Hayu Beit Abba Shayu Notnin Kelei Lavan LaKoves Nochri Shlosha Yamim Kodem LaShabbat. They used to give the white clothing, which took a lot of work to clean it. They used to give it to the laundromat, the non-Jewish launder, not money laundering. It sounds like launderer. It sounds like nowadays we have the Chinese, but I don't think they had that back then. 3 days before. We're going to see in the Gemara why this is. That basically, according to Beit Shammai, you're not allowed to. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was following Beit Shammai. They were giving their clothing, the clothing that required 3 days of work. They would give it 3 days before Shabbat to the cleaners. Now, but it says that everybody agrees, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai both agree that you can do this. If you have a wine press or an olive press, you can put the boards, what they used to do is they would put heavy boards on top of the olives or on top of the grapes to squeeze out the remaining juice after you had already crushed them. They would put these boards that the weight would just stay there and exert pressure and extract the rest of the juice. So you're allowed to do that. Now the Gemara is going to explain why. Basically, because even according to Beit Shammai, it's not a problem of Shevitat Kelim, because even for a person to do that is only D'Rabbanan, because the main work has already been done. And what you're putting on, when you put those boards on, it's just finishing it off. It's not really Deoraita, so they're not going to be so strict to say that you can't leave it going over Shabbat. We're going to see. The Gemara is going to work on that problem later. So now the Gemara says, so we have a question, which is, the very first case of the Mishnah was pouring water together with the dye, and the dye then disintegrates or softens in the water, and you create dye out of putting the material in the water. So who is the one that says that this is the soaking of dye? Just putting water and dye together is all you have to do. You don't have to stir it. Now, what melacha are you violating, by the way, by soaking the dye or soaking the animal food in water? No, you're violating lash. Actually, you're violating kneading. Kneading, not Needing, kneading. That's not a violation. That's just a state of mind, kneading something. No, kneading, 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 is kneading, in other words, kneading dough, mixing the dough, flour with water. So if you just pour flour on top of water, or vice versa, water on top of flour, that's not kneading. Kneading is squishing it together, right? So here, though, Beit Shammai is saying you can't even soak these materials in water, even if you don't do anything with it. So that's not, but it's considering that kneading. So the Gemara is asking, who is the one who says that simply putting these materials in water is considered kneading? Amar Rav Yosef, Rabbihi. This is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi who says this. Titania, as it says in the Braita, Echad notenet hakemach ve'echad notenet hamayim, acharon chayav. Divrei Rabbi. Rabbi says if one person put flour into a pot and one person poured water onto it, even if nobody mixed it together, nobody actually kneaded it, still, that's considered kneading, according to Rabbi. Rabbi Yossi Omer Eno Chayav Ad Sheyigabel. According to Rabbi Yossi, it's not considered kneading until you actually mix it together in the form of kneading that we know. Just mixing water and flour together is not enough. You have to actually make them into a new substance. And so therefore, Rabbi would be represented in our Mishnah, because it's saying that all you have to do is soak this material in water for it to be considered kneading. Amar le Abai said, "V'dilmad kan lo kama Rabbi Yossi ela b'kemach debar gibulu." But maybe even Rabbi Yossi would agree in our case. Why? Because Rabbi Yossi was talking about a case where it was flour and water. Over there, really, there is such a concept of making a dough out of flour and water. But over here, aval diod debar gibulu ema lechayev. But maybe here, where there really isn't anything, you don't make a mixture of water with the substance, the dye substance. It just disintegrates in there over time. So maybe he would agree that that's as far as it goes in terms of kneading in this case. It's not true. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ad Sheyigabel, because we have another Braita where they're talking not about flour, but about efer, about ashes. Now you put ashes in water. What have you have to knead it together? No, it's going to disintegrate in there and make its own substance. You're not going to have to do anything. And yet even there, Rabbi Yossi says it's only kneading if you actually get in there and you actually do something to mix them together and make them into something. So you see that in our case, he's certainly going to disagree and say that just soaking the material for the dye in water is not enough to be considered kneading. But maybe what it meant in that Braita was afar. Sometimes the word efer with an aleph, which means ashes, can be used to mean afar, dirt. And we all know from making mud pies that mixing water with dirt does in fact make a substance and can be kneaded together into something that looks very delicious. So, kneading certainly is applicable to dirt and water, maybe not to ashes and water. So the Gemara says Vatanya Efer, but it says Efer with an aleph. Vatanya Afar. There are actually two Baraitot. One that says Efer, one that says Afar. Mi de Gabe Hadade Tanya. So what we know. So basically, in the end, the point is we don't know. It could be that what it meant to say in each of the Baraitot was Efer. And it just sometimes it uses afar and sometimes uses efer. It could be that it actually meant efer. And even in the case of ashes, Rabbi Yossi says you have to actually knead them together, a separate action beyond pouring the water and the ashes together. Or it could be that what was meant in both cases was actually afar, was actually dirt. And that's why he requires you to do a separate action of combining the water with the dirt. But in our case, he might agree, since there's no actual kneading that can take place, that just mixing the water with these substances is considered kneading. So these are all cases of things you can leave on Erev Shabbat and they can run all Shabbat long. So for example, you can open up, let's say, they had, instead of plumbing, you could basically open a little a door and it would allow the water to flow in from a stream into your garden to water your garden. So you open up that stream. In other words, you open up whatever's blocking it. Let's say they had a big stream going by and there were little tributaries that would come off and one would go into your field. It was constructed that way, but you would block it. So when you wanted the water to come in, you would just open it. So we have something called a hose today, for that. We don't have this. But the point is that you could open this hose, basically their version of a hose, and it would come in, the water would flow in all Shabbat long. And you can open, and you can even put clothing. They used to scent their clothing by burning incense under it. Or they would burn other materials, or gofrit is like sulfur. They would burn under their vessels, that it would give it some kind of quality of, it had some beneficial properties to do that. Yeah, to fume it. But they wanted it for some reason. It would improve the quality of the kelim. And you can put a medicine on top of your eye or a bandage on your arm, and it's going to heal you all Shabbat long. In other words, anything you do before Shabbat, you can do, and it can work all Shabbat long, and it's no problem. However, there's one thing you can't do. You cannot put wheat into a mill that runs by water. The water mills that they would have, the water flowing would make the mill run. You can't do that unless it's going to be finished before Shabbat starts. So why can you do all these other things, but you can't do that? So my tama, what's the reason? Amar Rabba mipnei shemashma'at kol, because the reason is because it makes a noise, and people hear the grinding and they say, "Hey, look, Yankel is grinding, wheat on Shabbat. What kind of a Jew is he?" So because it makes a loud noise, we don't allow it. Amar le Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, "V'le mamar mishum shevitat kelim." What about shevitat kelim? Maybe this Mishnah or this Braita holds of the idea of shevitat kelim, that your mill can't work on Shabbat, even if you're not doing anything. Detanyas, we said in the Braita, because it says in the Pasuk about everything which I've told you, tishameru, you should guard, you should be careful. I believe that's in Parshat Mishpatim. Lerabot shevitat kelim, which comes to include shevitat kelim. So we see that there's an idea of shevitat kelim. Now he doesn't have the conclusion of the sugya yet. In the conclusion, Beit Hillel doesn't agree with the concept of shevitat kelim. But right now he's saying maybe everybody agrees with shevitat kelim here. Ela amar Rav Yosef mishum shevitat kelim. Therefore, the mill can't be run. You cannot put your mill in motion on Erev Shabbat because it's going to be running on Shabbat, and that is an extension of you. It's like you're grinding on Shabbat. But wait a second, you're telling me that Beit Hillel holds of shevitat kelim, that even your objects can't work for you. But gofritu mugmar ma'ita masharu. What about you? But in that Braita itself, it gave several examples of things that you're allowed to set in motion before Shabbat. For example, the scenting of the clothing. For example, the fumigating of the kelim. So why are you allowed to do those things though, Erev Shabbat? So it says, Mishum delo ka'avid ma'aseh, because there's no action involved. In other words, you set, let's say, your, this stuff burning on the ground. There's no kli. There's no vessel of yours that's doing anything. You're just hanging your clothes over this incense. The incense is burning. But you don't have any vessel working. You just set a fire. The fire is not a vessel. Shivitat kelim means there has to be a vessel that's working. There's no vessel. What about the fact that in our Mishnah it says that you can put these bundles of flax into the oven in order to be bleached with the hot oven over Shabbat? Similarly there, nothing's happening. There's a fire burning. They're sitting in the oven. The fire is not a kli. The fire is not by itself is not considered to be a vessel, and so they're sitting in an oven. So big deal. The oven's not actually doing anything. The oven is just there. There's a fire burning, and the kelim and the pishtan, the flax is being bleached. Okay. Omenach naicha mitzudat chayav ve'of v'dagim deka avid maaseh. So what's the reason why what's the reason? Oh, actually, that comes from the part before. In other words, umenach na'echa means that it's just sitting there. In other words, it's not doing anything. So mitzudat chayav of dagim dekavid maaseh ma'itama sharu. Why did they allow then? Why did Beit Hillel say that you could leave traps for animals erev Shabbat? Then isn't the trap going to do something? So he says hatam nami balachi v'kokre delo kavid maaseh. He's talking about traps that don't do an action. What's a trap that doesn't do an action? You leave a hook. Okay, the animal comes, it gets stuck on the hook. The hook didn't move, it didn't do anything. It's just sitting there. Or you leave a certain type of, Rashid describes, like a certain type of trap that basically was open on one end and narrow on the other end. The animal walks in, it gets stuck in there. The trap didn't move, the trap didn't do anything, just sitting there. So in all these cases, nothing's happening. So, V'hashad amar Rav Oshaya amar Rav Asi man tana shvitat kelim deoraita Beit Shammai v'lo Beit Hillel. But we don't hold like this opinion of Rav Yosef. We say that it isn't Beit Hillel that holds of Shivitat Kelim. It's only Beit Shammai that holds of Shivitat Kelim. It's only Beit Shammai that says that you can't have your Kelim working on Shabbat. The Beit Shammai, ben ka'avid ma'aseh, ben delo ka'avid ma'aseh asur. The Beit Hillel afal gav de ka'avid ma'aseh sharei. But we hold that Beit Shammai, whether the vessel is doing an action or not, it's considered to be a problem of Shavitat Kelim. That's why even, let's say, in a case where the oven is just sitting there holding the stuff inside and the fire is next to it, it's not considered that the Kli is actually doing anything. Or even a trap that's passive, like a hook sitting there and the animal comes and gets stuck on the hook. All of these things, Beit Shammai will say that's still a problem of Shavitat Kelim. Even if what happens is passive, it's still Shavitat Kelim. Okay? So if that's true, that Beit Shammai is the one that when we said that you cannot let your mill run on Shabbat, that according to Rav Yosef, that can only be Beit Shammai then. Because only Beit Shammai holds of Shavitat Kelim. But Beit Shammai extends Shavitat Kelim so far that even smoking the clothes should be a problem. Even fumigating the Kelim should be a problem. So, and we turn to Amud Bet, Mugmar ve'gofrit ma'ita'ama sharu. So, what is the reason why according to Beit Shammai, he's going to allow you to perfume your clothing, or he's going to allow you to fumigate your kelim? Ma'ita'ama sharu Beit Shammai, hatam banacha ar'a. So too he's going to have to say that it's sitting on the floor, and there is no kli. Not just that it's sitting in a bowl, and the bowl's not doing anything, and the incense is just burning inside the bowl and it's not doing anything. Because that, according to Beit Shammai, would still be a problem. Beit Hillel, according to what we said before, if there's a difference between passive and active, that would be considered passive. But Beit Shammai doesn't make a distinction between passive and active. If your kli is involved in a melacha, even if the bowl's just sitting there and the incense is burning inside, it's a problem. So he's going to say the incense is on the ground. There's no vessel. There's no vessel involved. And since there's no vessel involved, it's not going to be a problem. Yeah. He would say you can have a refrigerator. So then what does he say? Gigit v'neruk dera ushifud ma'ita'ama sharu Beit Shammai. But we have a different problem then. What if a person is making beer, and the beer takes 8 days to make, he says here. So you have it in a big vat. Or a person has a Shabbat candle. He lights on Friday at night. Or a person has a kedera. He leaves a pot on the stove on Friday night. Or a person has a spit that meat is roasting on, because it talked about, for example, the Korban Pesach, that they would have the Korban Pesach sitting over the flame even into Shabbat. So how is Beit Shammai going to explain any of these things? He doesn't light Shabbat candles, Beit Shammai? because it's shvitat kelim. So the answer is the mafkarlu afkure, that they would have to be mafkir. They would have to make it hefker. They would have to declare it ownerless before Shabbat. Their Shabbat candles, in order to avoid the problem of shvitat kelim. And so the Tosafot says that there would have to be a Tanai Bet Din. The Bet Din would basically institute that everyone's kelim were ownerless before Shabbat, so that way, if they left their Shabbat candles, they wouldn't be violating Shabbat. Very interesting. Mantan Allah Datan Rabbanan, who is the author of the following statement of the rabbis? Lo temala isha kedera asasiyot v'turmusin v'taniach letoch hatanor erev Shabbat imchashecha avim netanan lemotzei Shabbat asurim b'chdei she'asu kayotze v'lo yimalei nachtom havit shel mayim v'yaniach letoch hatanor erev Shabbat imchashecha avim asa ke'en lemotzei Shabbat asurim b'chdei she'asu. There are two statements. You can't put beans in a pot over the fire on Erev Shabbat unless they're going to be done before Shabbat starts, and you can't put water over the fire to boil. It says the chef can't do it, the baker or the chef can't do it unless it's going to be heated before Shabbat starts. So, and if you did that and it heated over Shabbat, you put it over the stove right before Shabbat and it actually heated on Shabbat, after Shabbat you have to wait for the amount of time that it took for it to cook before you're allowed to benefit from it. In other words, it's even prohibited to be benefited from on Shabbat. So who's the one that said that? Lema Beit Shammai? Is it Velo Beit Hillel? We must say that this is Beit Shammai, because Beit Shammai is saying your pot can't be doing work for you on Shabbat. And that's why the pot being over the fire is a problem. Rather, Beit Hillel is going to agree with this. Here, even Beit Hillel agrees, because a person might come to stoke the coals on Shabbat. In other words, you put beans over the fire, and beans take a little bit of time to cook. And it's Friday night, and your guests come over, and you say, "Oy vey, I'm not going to have food ready in time." You're going to go and stoke the coals. Or the water's not heating in time. You're going to play around with the fire. We're worried you might do that. So that's why. And basically the rule is, the way the halakha is brought, the rule is anything which you will put on the flame, that you're going to forget about it. It takes so long to cook, like a piece of raw meat. It takes so long to cook, you're not going to plan on having it for your Friday night dinner. You forget about it when you put it in on Friday. That you're allowed to do. But anything that it's a chance that it could be ready tonight, but it takes effort, that's where the problem is. Because you might think to yourself, oh, it might be ready tonight, so I'm going to leave it right before Shabbat, and when I come home from synagogue, it'll be ready, and you come home and it's not ready. So you might end up playing with the fire accidentally, and we don't want that to happen. So what about the case of scenting your clothing or fumigating your kelim? Why are you allowed to do that then, according to Beit Hillel? The reason why we're not worried there that the person is going to play with the coals, because if he does, it's going to create too much smoke and it's going to ruin the vessels, or it's going to ruin the clothes. They're going to smell like smoke instead of like the good perfume. So we're not worried there. What about the fact that he said that according to Beit Hillel you can leave the flax? In other words, before, when we thought this was all Shvitat Kelim, it was simpler. Now we're saying that Beit Hillel really allows all of this stuff. So why is he? So why does he prohibit only in the case of leaving food over the fire on Friday? Why doesn't he prohibit in all these cases? So he says, Hatam kevan de kashelo zika lo megalule. That why does he allow you to leave flax in the oven over Shabbat? Why is he not worried that you're going to play with the fire? The answer is because opening the oven door will ruin it. The whole process will be ruined if you open the oven door, because the wind will come in. What about Beit Hillel says you can leave clothing in the vat of dye over Shabbat to become colored? How can you do that? Amar Shmuel b'yorah ukura. That Shmuel says it must be talking about where you took the pot off of the fire. That's why Beit Hillel is allowing you to leave the clothes soaking in there, because even stirring it, you're not going to be cooking. But what about if he stirs it off the fire? It's still a problem. It must be that he sealed it as well. In other words, if you took it, the point is that according to Beit Shammai, the very fact that the clothes are dying on Shabbat, becoming dyed, is a problem. So even if it's sealed and it's off the flame, it's a problem for Beit Shammai, because there's a process going on. According to Beit Hillel, if you take it off the flame, so there's no concern about you playing with the fire, and you cover the top, so there's no concern about you stirring it on Shabbat, so there's no problem of you making a mistake on Shabbat and violating Shabbat, it's no problem that the process continues through Shabbat. But now that we have this principle, that Beit Hillel, even though technically he doesn't have a problem with you leaving food to cook over Shabbat, like Beit Shammai does, He's going to prohibit it because Shema Yachteh B'Gechalim, because you might come to play with the coals. Hai Kedera Chayita. Therefore, you can put a pot of raw meat over the flame right before Shabbat. What's the reason? Because since there's no chance that this raw meat is going to be ready tonight for Friday night, if you leave it slow cooking over the stove, there's no concern. This is chalent. Why? It's a complicated thing. It's not so simple. It's not so simple. If you knew that every time you did it that was going to happen, it would be more complicated. But you don't, because it doesn't always. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to have air conditioning, because if you open the door, it's going to make the air conditioner go on. Or you can't have heat because you open the door at the winter time. So it's because each time you do it, it doesn't necessarily happen. That's why you're allowed to. That's why you have some leeway. Uvashil shapir dami. And if something is totally cooked, also you can leave it over. So if it's totally cooked, it's fine. If it's uncooked, it's fine, because in both cases you don't have any motivation to play with the coals. Bashil velo bashil asir. But when it's in the middle range, that's the problem. When it's partially cooked but not there yet, that's where we have a problem. So what can you do? If you want to put chalent, you want to put dafina, then you throw in a piece of raw meat right before Shabbat. So that way you're demonstrating that you're not going to be playing with this over Shabbat. But you told us another principle. There were two principles. One was we're concerned about stoking coals. The other is that that any time that opening the oven would ruin the food, we're not concerned, because we say that you're not going to open the oven. So I bisra de gadya visharik shapir damei de barcha velo sharik asur. Okay, so he says that if you have meat that is of a type that's from a young animal, and you closed, in other words, because when you have a young animal's meat, so apparently the wind won't affect it. Okay, but you sealed the oven. So that way, since you sealed the oven, visharik, you sealed the oven, we don't have a problem. Okay, but it says de barcha velo sharik. When it's de barcha, it's a type of meat that's from an older animal, so therefore the wind won't affect it. Velo sharik, and you didn't seal the oven, asur, you're not allowed to use it. In other words, if there's any way where there's a concern that you're going to open the oven, either because the food won't be ruined by the oven, and the oven is not sealed, or the other way around. If the food won't be ruined by the oven's opening, then you have to seal it. If the food would be ruined by the oven's opening, you don't have to seal it, because we know you're not going to open it. Okay, that's what they said so far. So, but what about de gadya velo sharik, de barcha visharik? In other words, do you need? The question is, what if you had a situation? Can you rely on one or the other? In other words, when you have both, when you sealed it, and the food is something that's sensitive, there for sure it's no problem. You have two positives. You have two mitigating factors, because you sealed it, and you know that even if you you wouldn't want to break the seal because the food is sensitive. Well, what about when there's only one, where the food is sensitive but it's unsealed, or the food is not sensitive but it's sealed? Because one or the other good. So we know when you have both, it's good. What about one or the other? Rav Ashi Sharei, Rav Yirmiyah Midiftei Asir. So there's a machloket. Rav Ashi says having one or the other is enough, as long as there's a deterrent, either a deterrent that the oven is sealed, or the deterrent that the food is sensitive. You don't need both. According to Rabbi Yirmiyah, you need both deterrents in order to be allowed to leave it over Shabbat. Well, the Rav Ashi the Sharei, but according to Rav Ashi that says it's okay. Entolin basar batal betza el kedei sheyitzol mi'od yom hatam de barcha velo sharik. So basically they asked him a question. So what about the situation where you have meat? It said that you can't leave meat over the coals unless it's going to be completely cooked before Shabbat starts. So how does Rav Ashi deal with that? So he says, that must be the barcha velo sharik. That's a case where the food is not sensitive and it's unsealed. So therefore there is a concern that you're going to play with the coals, because since there's no deterrent, the oven is not sealed and the food is not sensitive, so you're not worried about opening the oven. to play around with the coals. So there's a concern. But in a case where you had a mitigating factor, either there was the deterrent that the oven was sealed, or there was the deterrent that the food was too sensitive to open the oven, you'd be okay. There's another version of this here. Gadya ben sharik ben lo sharik shapir. That everybody agrees if the food is sensitive, you don't need any sealing on the oven. Okay, that's fine. Shapir dame. De barchanami visharik shapir dame. And everybody agrees that if the food is not sensitive and it's sealed, it's okay. So if you're sealed, you're definitely okay. If the food's sensitive, you're definitely okay. Ki pelige, where do they argue? De barcha velo sharik. Where the food is not sensitive, but it's unsealed. Okay? Can we rely on so the Rav Ashi Sharei, Rav Yirmiyah B'Difti Asir. So Rav Ashi is saying that it's okay, and Rav Yirmiyah B'Difti says it's prohibited. So the Rav Ashi the Sharei insulin basar batal beital kadeshi told me bod yom hatam bevisra gumrei. So in other words, according to Rav Ashi is according to the second version very lenient. He's saying that even in a case where the food is hardy, so it's not going to be ruined by opening the oven door, and even when you haven't sealed it, it's still okay. You can still leave it. So they said, but what about the case in the Mishnah where it says you can't place meat over the coals? So according to Rav Ashi, there's no case of that then. There's no case, because he says if it's sensitive that you won't open the oven door, no problem. If it's insensitive, also no problem. It doesn't matter at all according to Rav Ashi. You can always leave it. We're not concerned. So according to that, what about the case in the Mishnah? So he says, Hatam bevisra gomrei. That's talking about meat that's directly on the coals. And since it's directly on coals, it's not in an oven. There's nothing separating between you and the oven at all. Rav Ashi says there has to be some deterrent. You know what the deterrent is? Opening the oven door. Because before you open that oven door, you're going to remember it's Shabbat. But if it's just sitting there on coals at your campfire, and you're cooking the meat, there, even Rav Ashi is going to say that's no good. So Rav Ashi before was saying you could rely on the fact that you have to open the door, that you're going to remember not to open it, since you can't just easily access the coals. But in a case where you can easily access them, even he is going to say that's not, that's no good. Amar Ravina says, Hi, karachaya shapir dame, kevan de kashele zika kevesrad de gadya dame. He says that this gourds, basically, that you would put in the oven is similar to the meat that's sensitive. That since the wind will affect it, will ruin it. If you open the oven, you can leave it over the fire over Shabbat, and you don't have to be worried that somebody will come, open the oven, and allow the wind to come in. Now we'll just do this last part here. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Beit Shammai omrim lo yimkor adam chefto lenochri v'lo yishilenu v'lo yalvenu v'lo yiten lo b'matana l'kedei she'yagil beito. That Beit Shammai says you can't sell something to a person, a non-Jew, and you can't lend him something. Yashilenu means to lend him an object. Yalvenu means to lend him money. And you can't give him a gift unless he's going to get home before Shabbat. Beit Hillel omrim kedei she'yagil labayit hasamuch lachoma. Beit Hillel says as long as he gets to the house that's next to the wall. In other words, as long as he gets to the next city, he gets to his city. He doesn't have to get to his house. He has to at least get to his city. Rabbi Akiva Omer kedei she'yetzeh mipetach beito. He says as long as he gets out of your house, Rabbi Akiva says it doesn't matter. As long as he's out of your house before Shabbat starts, it's no problem. So you have three opinions. Rabbi Akiva says as long as he's out of your house before Shabbat, you can give him whatever you want. He's out of your house before Shabbat, no problem. Beit Hillel says he has to at least get to his city. Beit Shammai says he has to get to his house. Am Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, hen divrei Rabbi Akiva, hen divrei Beit Hillel. Really, Rabbi Akiva and Beit Hillel are saying the same thing. Lo bar Rabbi Akiva elo lefaresh divrei Beit Hillel, and Rabbi Akiva was just coming to explain Beit Hillel. In other words, when Beit Hillel said that he has to be able to get to his city, he was just trying to make the point that he has to get out of your house. He wasn't literally saying that he has to get to his city. He just has to be out of your house. And this is the halacha even today, that you can't give a non-Jew something that they're going to carry out of your house, because it's going to either look like you sold them something on Shabbat, or it's going to look like they're doing a shlichut for you on Shabbat, that they're your messenger on Shabbat. If they leave your house on Shabbat, there's a concern that it looks like you did commerce on Shabbat, or you sent them on a mission on Shabbat. If they leave before Shabbat starts, it's no problem, and we're not stringent about that in a case like that. Have a great day.